Black is king. I have opinions. So, last week, Beyonce released her visual album, Black is King, on Disney Plus, in companion with the Gift album. So, this is the visual album for the album that was inspired by Lion King. So, this is kind of like the third and final part of this whole Lion King artistic expression. So, there's been a lot of opinions, there's been a lot of think pieces about this work. When I tell you there are people whose entire life's work is dedicated to the topics that are discussed in this visual album, people that are historians in African arts and African culture and African tribal religions, like there is so much stuff to unpack here. I try to do my due diligence in my research, but there's gonna be a lot of things I missed, so I'm going to speak from what I saw and from what I know, my personal experience and what I've looked up. So, the first thing I want to talk about is how the film treats African spiritualism. So, in my opinion, whenever we see African spiritualism in any type of media, it is always portrayed as demonic. Personally, American Horror Story Coven, they did a lot with voodoo, they did a lot with African spiritualism and that. And now let me tell you, when it comes to voodoo and hoodoo, like there's a whole culture, there's a whole difference. And I personally saw a lot of mixing of different practices and different spiritualities in that show, and I didn't like how the black witches were portrayed as kind of demonic, and then the white witches were always kind of not portrayed as demonic. Anyways, I didn't really like how African spiritualism always has this kind of negative connotation. What I loved about this is in the first shot, we have everybody in white. It is very angelic, and but it's still traditional. Like it's still in the tradition of, the African tradition. But I like the fact that throughout the entire piece, the African spiritualism, African tradition is never portrayed as demonic. It's never portrayed as evil. It's just literally portrayed as what it is a different culture and a different way to express oneself and find meaning in this whole thing we call life. So I really appreciate the fact that the team behind it did the research and did the work to not only find out what was traditional, what was correct, but also to portray it as something that was not negative. So I think that's such a big plus mark. The mythology. Okay, so for those who don't know, as there is like Roman and Greek gods, there's also African gods, and there's a whole myths and legends and so much rich history about the Orishas, and like it's really cool. Personally, I wish that there was almost like a Percy Jackson style series talking about them. They have really cool backstories, and I think it's really cool mythology. I've always liked African mythology a little bit more just because I think it was more in nature. I think it's really fun. I think you've seen American Gods on Showtime. They kind of get into that. It's really fun. But I like the fact that you saw throughout the whole film, you saw the Orishas and you saw different pieces of mythology. The guy in the green ash, when I looked this up, he's a water genie, which I thought was cool. I thought it was cool that that's something that's in African culture, that we have genies as well. And I thought it was like dope, man. I was like really into that. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. Something I didn't know. So like you can probably freeze any frame in this film and find some type of mythology, some type of ancestral thing. So not only to speak to that, but I also want to speak to the other influences that are in this video. It's not just African spiritualism, but just cinematography wise, there's a big influence on let me look it up. So this film is heavily influenced by Daughters of the Dust by Julie Dash. It follows members of the Pazant family, Gila Islanders, who live at the Igbo landing on Data Island off the Georgia coast. And a lot of the visuals of the water and the white linen, I think this film has influenced so much of black filmmaking. If you get a chance, it is free on the Criterion channel. It's a great film. if you just see like black people, white linen, and water, it's probably influenced by this film. But there's just so many influences from other black creatives. This team has definitely done their research into what has been done and what has been expressed, and I think there's, once again, so many layers to this film. Costumes. My. Wow. Like, this entire time I'm watching this, I was like, the budget of this production must be ridiculous, but that's that Disney money. Just the detail on every type of costume. These were just so intricate. Like, it wasn't just like... The thing that I really liked about all the costumes is, like, each look was something I'd never seen before. I'm like, oh, I didn't know we could do that. I didn't know that this was a thing. It was stuff that was familiar from both American culture and African culture, but it was just so different. It was just such unique looks. You could probably do a whole breakdown of the costumes, but just magnificent, and the influences and how they change in each number. So, the Lion King theming. So, I don't... I really want to see what this movie would have been like if it did not have to be a Lion King thing. You know what I mean? I would like to have seen what this whole experience would have been like if we didn't have to insert the clips from the Lion King movie, if we were still following this narrative of like a young boy growing up and finding himself, because I think that narrative is so valid. And because there's certain points where we stick to it, then we abandon it, because let's be really honest, the story of Lion King is very male centered. I mean, that's not a bad thing, it's not a negative thing, that's just how the story is. Like, Simba is the main character. Nala does not get any type of real character development throughout the entire film. And what I think was a nice course correction is that there's a clear act break right before Brown Skin Girls, where we're going into more of the the woman's side of the story, what the effects of, you know, the choices of the men in this world, like their decision of leaving the community, their decision of self-hatred, how that affects the women in this patriarchal society, which was not lost upon me. It's set up really well. This very, beginning of the film is this very masculine male tale, and we're setting up this very patriarchal view of society. And then once we see the poor choices made by the men in this world and how that affects the women and their response to that is very smart. That's I didn't see the new CGI Lion King. I didn't really care to see it, but I think that was a very nice addition to the story of Lion King, and I thought that made that a very balanced film, and it was very interesting. We're going to get into more of that later. So, the overall criticism of this film, or I call it the Twittercism. Now, there are a lot of, you know, little tweets, little threads talking about the capitalist, the angle of the movie, how it's promoting wealth. I'm going to tell you right now, that's completely unfounded. So, if you're on Twitter and you're just seeing Mood Forever, I can understand why you'd be like, oh, this is capitalist propaganda. This is all about wealth. You're missing the lessons of, you know, the ancestors. Yeah, no, not valid, because in Jealousy and Mood Forever, I think are the two times we really see this very display of opulence and wealth. First of all, this is not lost upon me that Jealousy and Mood Forever are the two numbers where it's more European than it is African. Note that. That's very interesting. If you notice in the clothing in Jealousy and Mood Forever, that's the only time we really see people in traditional European dresses, and we see the men in suits. I think that's very interesting, because in Jealousy, we see wealth displayed as this very dark and evil thing, but in Mood Forever, because when I was watching this, I was like, so if we're following this Lion King narrative, how are we going to do Hakuna Matata? Because Hakuna Matata hasn't really, like, aged well. Like, it's a fun song. It's like, da, 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 you know, like, it's fun. It's a cute number. But if we're following this whole narrative of, like, Simba going back to his roots and leaving traditional African everything, and it's just like, you know, don't worry about anything, that's still like, that's like negative positivity. Hakuna Matata is negative positivity, and that's a hot take, but I stand by it. But Moon Forever was a lovely way to do that, because if you look at the way it's shot, you have, you know, the young Simba character falling asleep into this dream world, and I think it's so interesting as to what they depicted that dream world being. I like that it was this very 50s glam. It was very luxurious, but what a child thinks is luxurious. Like, it's old cars, it's 50s glam. There's a lot of like Audrey Hepburn nods. The synchronized swimming, like, it felt like a big MGM musical. And I think that's what a child would think wealth looks like. I think that's just like so spot on. And one detail I really loved is that on the dinner table, like, it's just a huge bowl of Welch's fruit snacks, which, like, yeah, that would be in my house if I had endless amount of resources. I think it's also really telling that to a black viewer, wealth doesn't look like power, it looks like accessibility. So I think that's really interesting about that, because he had access to the food he wants, they had access to the clothes they wanted. I think the one image that was really strong was Beyonce and Jay-Z eating the lavish food but still on the like the TV trays. Like, they're still like true to their tradition where they came from, but they just have accessibility to better food. I think food is very political, and I think how they did food in that whole section was very interesting. I'm one of those people that when I watch movies, I always look at like what they're eating, because I think that's interesting. But yeah, the whole capitalism criticism is, I think it's not based. There's no base to it. I think that this is the reason why you need to watch the entirety of a piece of media before judging it, because I think once you watch the entire film, you're going to see why those sequences were there and what purpose they serve. Besides that, my one knock to it is that it is very heteronormative, and in my opinion, I think that's a Disney thing and not a Beyonce thing. There were inclusion of trans women in a couple of the numbers, which was very welcoming and very refreshing. But it was very heteronormative near the end, in the sense that, like, you see the black feminine and the black masculine coming together to kind of heal themselves. I would have liked to have seen not necessarily a purely heteronormative, a purely nuclear sense of that, because, you know, African family structures, just the structure is not nuclear. Like, you look at it, the African family structure is very communicative. It's all about community, and I think that's certainly something that was in the film, but the marriage scene past, it felt very heteronormative. It felt very nuclear family, which, like, I get. I think that's something that the African American community has been striving towards. I think there's always a narrative of, like, the black man is missing in the home, and that's like, that is such a thing in our community, and I think that's such a thing to speak to. And I think for a lot of people, seeing a wedding and seeing a black man and a black woman love each other and be together, that's a powerful image. I wouldn't remove that, but I would add to it. That's like the most microcosm of a criticism. But I want to get into the gender politics of this piece. There's a lot here. I think this speaks a lot to how colonialism affected black men and black women very differently. And I think it's very interesting showing that trickle-down trauma of how that works. Because in the beginning, you see, like, young Simba doing his thing, and how that white supremacy affects him is, because, you know, usually in the African tradition, the man is the hunter, he's a gatherer, he's there to provide for his family. But I think that need gets almost exacerbated by a colonial effect, because, you know, once you introduce all these new things like the cars, the money, the wealth, like, oh, you want that even more, and you're running after that, you're searching for that, because once you see someone that has more power than you, you're going to chase after that. And by chasing after that, as we see in the film, like, he loses all of his tradition, everything that was valuable to him, and then he's kind of, you know, metaphorically and literally, because this is Lion King, has left Pride Rock to, you know, just die and be destroyed. And that affects, because this is all a patriarchal society, and colonialism only aids a patriarchal society, only makes it worse. And because it's a patriarchal society, as we see in the movie Lion King, Scar's in charge, the women have no power because it's a patriarchal society. And the women are being affected by the colorism, the sizeism, all the effects of colonialism that come with a European standard that is now being forced upon African standards. So they have to abandon, like, much like the men have to abandon their Africanness to fit into this European society. Because the men rule the society, they have now adopted the European standards, so now they have to get in line to make this work inside a thing. And so what I think was very smart of the film and the way they presented this is saying, we have to eliminate the self-hatred inside of ourselves, and we have to eliminate the white supremacy inside of ourselves for this to work. And because that society in the movie was patriarchal, and the society still here today is patriarchal, until black men can eliminate that self-hatred and eliminate that that internalized white supremacy, they cannot help their community. You're kind of a lame duck. And I thought that was really smart, because until he went back and he really started adopting traditionalism, only then was he able to come together with the black woman. And, you know, and then after that we have like a little fight song, like our little like Take Back Pride Rock number, and I'm like, that could not have been possible if they both did not do their healing. And I think that's so important. I think that's the biggest thing to take away from this film, is that we as black people have to heal. Like, we have made so many strides and we have so many more places to go, but we have to give ourselves that space and that ability to heal, because a lot of the hurt that we are not only doing to ourselves but to our community comes from self-hatred and this idea of internalized white supremacy. And you see that in the colorism in our community, you see that in the sizeism in our community, you see that in the homophobia in our community. That's all internalized white supremacy. And I think it's very important and very clear that that was so clear throughout the film, is that because black men in a sense are a privileged minority because they are men and this is a patriarchal society, until they heal themselves and use their privilege and a term for good to help black women, they cannot come together to fight supremacy. And that's the hot take. There's nothing more about that. Once again, I would have liked to have seen that be a little less heteronormative, but I think that applies to all things. In conclusion, I think it is very hard to name something Black is King and to get everything right. The Black experience is non-monolithic. There's going to be things that you may not resonate with. There's going to be things that I don't resonate with. But I think a beautiful quote that was in Dear White People was, you cannot tell people what they identify with. If there's going to be scenes that speak to you as a black person, and there's going to be scenes that don't speak to you. But the whole thing that's beautiful about his piece and in black art is that something speaks to somebody. You know, I think that personally, Find Your Way Back and a lot of the beginning spoke to me as a black man, and just on my journey it spoke to me. But like Brown Skin Girls as a black man does not hit as hard as it would if I was a black woman. You know, there's something for everybody in this piece, and I think it's very important to be critical, to have discussion, but I don't think it's helpful to be divisive. It's not helpful to be toxic about this. This is obviously a labor of love and an attempt to educate others about African culture. And I think as we go into our discussion about this, we have to remember that this is not an attempt to out-black each other or an attempt to say that this is the black experience and this is not, because it's not monolithic. Like and subscribe some more. And once again, those are my opinions.